Maybe if they spent less time and money harassing dissenters or imprisoning over 2 million of our fellow citizens. You know, there's a recent survey in the United Nations of how many prisoners are kept throughout the world. And it's estimated that there are 8 million people in prison in the world today. 2.2 million of them are in prison in the United States. You know, that's more than a quarter of the total number. And we call ourselves, ironically, the land of the free. Perhaps if these agencies weren't so focused on executing dozens of people each year, perhaps if they weren't focused on repressing those whose principal crime, if you want to call it that, is taking militant action to protect the environment from corporate destruction. Perhaps if they weren't doing all those things, then they would have had the time to protect us. So to conclude, we can't let our government make war on our civil liberties in the name of making war on terrorism. If we fool anyone, it's only ourselves when we cover up systematic policies that condone torture and foster human rights abuses. We can't let Bush and others destroy life, freedom, and the rule of law in the name of protecting it. And we don't need the blind obedience of those who claim to support our troops while supporting policies that are more likely to send them to their graves. And we need to understand what the phrase, "my country, right or wrong," means in a democracy. In a democracy, you vote your approval when you think your country is right. And in a democracy, it is your duty, not your right, but your duty to dissent and set it right when it's wrong. There is nothing more patriotic than to fight for our constitutional rights. Thank you.
Lauren Regan is an attorney, is a public interest attorney specializing in environmental law, civil rights, and criminal defense. She's also the founder and executive director of the Civil Liberties Defense Center, a nonprofit organization that strives to protect and educate the public as to their civil liberties and constitutional rights. She has successfully represented political activists in both civil and criminal litigation. The CLDC assists activists in curtailing government encroachment upon their right to protest, to defend activists in court, assists with political prisoner issues, and monitors current governmental attempts to restrict civil liberties and dissent.
I'm going to start with a quote. "The struggle of humanity against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting." Milan Kundera, a Czechoslovakian author and a former Communist Party member, said that. And it was the motivation for me inviting Robbie to the Northwest and to go on this mini speaking tour that we're on. After 9/11, Bush said, "Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. Those who scare peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty, my message is this: your tactics only aid terrorists." Compare that, from looking at history, to Hitler's second-in-command, Hermann Göring, who said, "The people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country." History repeating itself again and again. A dozen young people who, with no intention or harm to any living thing, burned property to save animals and the environment. The government trumped up charges against them so that they faced life plus 1,115 years in prison. 1,115 years for acts of economic sabotage that harmed no one and where great precautions were taken to ensure that that was the case. This sweep of cases, combined with that of Trey Arrow, Eric McDavid, Rod Coronado, and others, have been called the Green Scare. And for more information generally on the Green Scare, see our website, which is cldc.org. We coined the term Green Scare because of its similarities to the Red Scare of the 1950s. The similarities being the use of secret grand juries and inflammatory rhetoric, and its apparent political motivation in targeting citizens who oppose government conduct and are being used as scapegoats by the feds. This persecution comes as a result of the effectiveness of these movements. They became part of the radar screen because they were hitting corporations where it counts, their profits. The grassroots ecology and animal rights movements were becoming more and more effective, and the state needed to have an enemy within to justify its growing fascism. The government is shifting, as predicted, from using the word terrorist to extremist. It's only one step from there to radical or subversive or agitator, and it's only one other step until we start having the words activist or dissident branded with these negative terms. This is a historical moment for our movements, and like it was for the industrial workers of the world during the Palmer raids, again, history repeating itself. In 1988, there was an organization of timber barons and off-road vehicle users, private property rights, and conservative think tanks that formed themselves their own movement and called it the Wise Use Movement. Their leader, Ron Arnold, coined the term eco-terrorism in 1983. He defined it as any crime committed to save nature. He lobbied conservatives in Congress and other politicians, those politicians, of course, taking lots and lots of money from the organizations that formed the Wise Use Movement. And in a few years, we began to hear the term in the halls of Congress. Between 1993 and 2003, the number of FBI agents assigned to counterterrorism increased 224%. There are more than 1,669 FBI agents assigned solely to domestic terrorist investigations. The Joint Terrorist Task Forces are now in each of the 56 FBI offices across the country. Contrast that to the fact that recent statistics show 79% of Americans believe that environmental protections must be enforced more strongly, and 74% of Americans believe that the environment should be protected at any cost. The stakes were getting higher for those corporate interests. On December 7th of 2005, as Alex mentioned, one of the largest roundups of environmental and animal liberation activists in American history began. Using the codename Operation Backfire, the FBI arrested people in 4 separate states for taking part in a wide variety of economic sabotage actions against property. The government attributed these crimes to the Earth Liberation Front and the Animal Liberation Front, also known as the ELF and the ALF. These organizations don't have leaders, they have a website. The one thing that holds them together is a creed, and that creed says, do no harm to any living thing, human or non-human. On January 20th, federal prosecutors and former defiled U.S. Attorney General Alberto Gonzales announced a sweeping 65-count indictment, including conspiracy charges, as Robbie mentioned, against 11 individuals relating to 17 different incidents of property damage or sabotage in Oregon, Washington, Wyoming, California, and Colorado. The indictment charged various defendants with arson, attempted arson, and a very rarely used crime called carrying an incendiary device, or a destructive device. This crime, maybe 5 cases in the reported books, carries a 30-year mandatory minimum sentence. If you are facing 2 counts of it, it's mandatory life in prison. And the definition of the crime is basically to carry the parts or an actual incendiary device. In these cases, it was kerosene mixed with gasoline in buckets. That was the incendiary device. And many, almost all of the individuals faced those charges. Now, it's important to recall that the crimes that these people have been charged with started in 1996. They ended in 2001. If the government did not bring indictments within months, some of the statute of limitations were set to expire and the cases would never have been able to be prosecuted. Instead of doing real investigation or real law enforcement, they used a simple, old-fashioned bullying of the weak to say what the government wanted them to say against the other, stronger co-defendants, much like the green glasses against the Rosenbergs. There was no forensic evidence that linked any defendant to any of these crimes. It was good old-fashioned snitching. After many motions were filed, including one demanding NSA warrantless surveillance regarding the activists, the government finally agreed to plea bargains for most of the defendants. The ranges were 4 to a little more than 12 years. So we went from 1,115 years to 4 to 12 years when the courts got their hands on the cases. For the first time in the United States history, the government notified these defendants that it was going to seek the terrorist enhancement, its United States Sentencing Guidelines 3A1.4, if any of you are law geeks. The enhancement allows for an additional 20 years on top of any other sentence a defendant receives. It also means that they will be labeled a terrorist for the rest of their life, and as a result, their imprisonment will be at some of the most severe prisons in the country. All of these people were between the ages of 18 and 30 when they committed their crimes. None of them had prior convictions. With this enhancement, people who had never spent time in jail were being sent off to prisons with the most violent criminals in the United States. The reason that this was allowed to happen was because of an extremely broadened definition of terrorism that was slipped through the Patriot Act. It allowed the government to fit a square peg into a round hole. The reason? They wanted to proclaim victory on domestic terrorism. They couldn't catch any real terrorists, and so the bunny huggers were good enough. During the court hearings on whether acts of property damage that didn't result in any injuries whatsoever could be deemed acts of terrorism, the U.S. attorneys argued that acts of property damage like these were classic cases of terrorism. Now, just to give you a little insight, I'll give you an example of one of the arsons. People went and burned a horse slaughterhouse facility, a facility that was rounding up the last of our wild mustangs on public lands and turning them into dog food to be shipped to Japan. In the dead of night, they burned it to the ground, and it was never rebuilt to this date. That crime of a corporate Dutch company manufacturing dog food, as a result of arson of that facility, those individuals were deemed terrorists for the rest of their lives. Apparently, burning a horse slaughterhouse facility and flying planes into a building and killing humans are now the same, according to the federal government. They argued that because the conspiracy attempted to influence or affect the conduct of government, or to simply retaliate against the government, was enough to brandish the terrorist label. Defense lawyers asserted that the enhancement was only appropriate when human life was ended, when murder occurred. And historically, those were the only cases where it had ever been applied, is when human life was ended, like the Oklahoma City bombing. Despite the strong arguments of the defense lawyers, the judge in the case ruled that the terrorist enhancement was generally applicable to these cases, and that a federal crime of terrorism does not require a substantial risk of injury. The judge ruled that the terrorist enhancement applied to only 4 out of 20 of the incidents, but 7 out of 10 of the defendants were involved in those 4 incidents, so the majority of them got the terrorist enhancement applied to them. And those cases are on appeal. The terrorist enhancement aspect will go up to the Ninth Circuit. Civil rights attorneys monitoring the cases were flabbergasted and alarmed by the U.S. attorney's conduct during the proceedings. The vilification of environmentalism generally by government prosecutors and the overreaching use of the terrorist enhancement was astonishing. The federal government comparing individuals who burned buildings for animal rights or environmental concerns were compared to the KKK in court. The new federal laws indicate that destructive actions designed to influence or retaliate against the government now meet the criteria for terrorism in this country. Prosecutors have complete discretion on whether to seek this enhancement. They never sought it on any of the right-wing groups that killed abortion doctors. 5 since 2003 have been murdered. Right-wing militias, skinheads, other right-wing groups that have killed and injured human beings have not had this enhancement applied to them. And it's important to remember, just as the Rosenbergs were never charged with espionage or treason, these individuals were never charged with the crime of terrorism. It was only through this sentencing enhancement, a frosting on the cake of this case, that they were able to weasel this phrase into the media and into these cases. And again, it's the first time in the history of the United States that an individual has been labeled a terrorist for a property crime. The rulings in these cases set a very dangerous precedent for activists and others engaged in civil disobedience, like those engaged in the historic Underground Railroad or lunch counter sit-ins. Look at COINTELPRO and remember that history. COINTELPRO was used against Martin Luther King, the Student Nonviolence Organizing Committee, the Black Panthers, the Women's Strike for Peace, the Communist Party of the United States, Nation of Islam, Socialist Workers' Party, leftist students, and radical professors, all of them targeted by the federal government to disrupt successful and growing movements. And many times the government was successful in destroying them. And why? Because they held beliefs that the government was afraid of. Many activists engage in unlawful activities like civil disobedience to make change. It's part of our history. It's part of our democracy. And now it's terrorism. The government and the court both repeatedly tried to convince the public that the cases were not political nor intended to label these defendants as terrorists. Neither statement could be farther from the truth. The fact that Alberto Gonzales took time out of his day to hold a press conference with the FBI where he announced that the ELF and ALF were the #1 domestic terrorist threat to this country, although they never, ever harmed a single human being. It's laughable. Whether you burn a building for insurance money or to save wild horses from horrific slaughter, the crimes should be prosecuted and punished equally. That is one of the basic bedrocks of our justice system. And that did not happen in these cases. Further, the use of the terrorist word should not be used for trespassing and vandalism and other nonviolent crimes. It loses and diminishes its meaning, and it brands people who otherwise would never have been fallen under that word. And why? To stifle dissent. The brand was created by industry groups to protect their profits, and now is being used as a pretext to ensure that their economic profits will continue. To give you another little example, Senator Jeffords and Representative Bernie Thompson, who is the ranking member in the House of Representatives Homeland Security Committee, told Congress that of the failure of the Department of Homeland Security to assess threats posed by right-wing domestic terrorist groups, and urged the department not to focus on eco-terror, but on groups such as the KKK, militias, abortion clinic bombers, and skinheads. Those cases involved loss of human life, he said, to no avail in Congress. Former U.S. Attorney of New Mexico, David Iglesias, one of the fired U.S. attorneys, was quoted as saying, "The Oregon prosecutions appeared to be politically motivated, and that it seems to me what happened here does not fit my traditional definition of what terrorism is." Edward Said, who's a Columbia law professor, said, "Terrorism is anything that stands in the face of what we want to do. People's movements of resistance against deprivation, against unemployment, against the loss of natural resources, all of that is termed terrorism now." Don't forget, in Barack Obama made a statement to Congress. In 2003, there were 7,400 hate crimes and 450 massive environmental crimes that are still pending investigation 4 years later. But yet, millions and millions of dollars, and thousands of FBI agents were dedicated to some sabotage cases. So from my vantage point as part of the legal team that represented the non-cooperating defendants in this case, which, in case you'd like to write to them. Step there. We've been learning some lessons about the Bush regime, and tying on to Robbie's theme, I've got a couple that I'd like to share with you. Number one, terrorism is murder, not property damage. Number two, we're living in a police state. And this isn't just rhetoric, this is the truth. We need to make necessary adjustments in our habits and our lifestyles. Just because the government touts the Bill of Rights, don't expect it to come to your aid when you dissent against them. This does not mean that the US police state is going to disappear dissidents en masse. They don't have to. Look what they did with the Rosenbergs. They pick their targets carefully. What it really means is that we're increasingly trading our civil rights for the illusion of security and the paternalistic promise that the police will only go after the bad guys. Of course, they're the ones that decide who the bad guys are, and it's a constantly shifting thing. There's also a bunch of potential terrorist databases that have been created, over 7,000 names on them since 2003. They include anarchists, animal rights activists, environmental activists, and others. This is the terrorist watch list that our government is spending billions of dollars on. Know your rights and practice your rights. We've got a bunch of Know Your Rights brochures out in the lobby for you if you need a little brush up. You don't have to answer your door and you don't have to talk to the police. If the police show up with a warrant, you have to let them in, but you never have to consent. If you're questioned, you have your Miranda rights. It doesn't matter if they tell you them or not. You should know them and you should exercise them by saying you wish to remain silent, you want a lawyer, and then don't say anything else. The police and agents are authorized and allowed to lie to you, and they trick you and often make you talk or otherwise do what they want you to do. It's amazing how many activists and civil libertarians that I come into contact with forget their basic training when the pressure is on. Yes, you might arouse suspicion or anger by refusing to talk about your political involvements or your political activities and standing up to the officer and asserting those pesky fundamental rights. But their mere suspicion is not admissible against you at trial, and neither is your refusal to talk. They may make your life miserable for a day or a year, but that pales compared to the misery of spending many years behind bars or putting someone else there. Do an ego and bravado check, but don't stop important work that needs to get done. Work for social change, not to be cool or get social status. More of us need to dedicate the time and vision needed to build a lasting movement for social change. Make sure you're good to the people around you and continue to work and spread your vision. Talk, but don't gossip. First, talk. FBI surveillance and grand jury harassment are processes that thrive on secrecy. Drag them into the light and expose them. Be loud, truthful, and assertive. Don't spread gossip or innuendo or speculation. The state loves to pick up on that and can use it to justify their next moves. A favorite law enforcement tactic is to disturb the hive, then listen to the buzz. Only pass on information which you know is factual or which you know the government already knows. Know the law and why it may fail you. The law is an ever-expanding minefield of proscriptions, many of which are activities that are bad not because they're morally wrong, but because corporate lobbyists convince lawmakers that they're bad. In fact, such laws are ironically designed to shield behaviors which are bad. A perfect example is the 2006 law Congress passed for the pharmaceutical and research giants, which is called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And I've got brochures out at our table to give you more information about that. This is a law which shields people who torture animals and make profit off of it, while criminalizing free expression as terrorism again. And the CLDC, we're filing a constitutional lawsuit next month challenging this law based on its violations of the Constitution. Your basic high school civics classes are just not going to cut it any longer because not only are laws changing at an incredible pace, but many are unconstitutional. And don't overly count on a judiciary of Machiavellian, war-on-terror-addled judges to help you out. Learn the law, especially crimes that are favorites for harassing activists, dissidents, or those that are not in lockstep with the Bush regime. Such crimes are conspiracy, aiding and abetting, obstructing justice, harboring fugitives, contempt, and perjury. Always seek legal support, especially if you are subpoenaed or have contact with cops. Know your history. Activists have resisted and weathered other periods of repression in the United States, and for some communities, it's never ended. Consult your elders. They have a wealth of information and wisdom to impart concerning political repression. They've been through it before. Learn what you can and do your homework. And then I put up a list of some great books that I recommend everyone read if you're interested in these topics. The other thing I think is important is to create and maintain institutional knowledge and support. Create groups and email lists, raise support funds, raise a public outcry, show solidarity on courthouse steps. Everyone has a breaking point. Help people raise their breaking points through real support of targeted communities and activists. And reach across those cultural divides. Yours is not the only afflicted community. Share resources and support with other victims of government repression. We have a lot to teach each other, and we're stronger together. An example of this in the San Francisco Bay Area recently, animal rights activists that were targeted with grand juries teamed up with the Black Panthers, who are also being targeted after 30 years. The two movements coming together had a profound effect not only on their communities, but throughout the country. And there's a website, FBIWitchHunt.com, if you want more information on that merger. Finally, famed labor hero Joe Hill once said, "Don't mourn, organize." The government can't round all of us up, and they can't round up everyone who disagrees with them or are proud to call themselves dissidents or revolutionaries. Its aim, rather, is to make symbolic examples out of a few. Just like with Robbie's parents, everyone must reject the chill. We have strength in numbers. First off, show up. Don't rely on other people to show up for you. Second, be the media. The corporate media is incredible. They are the filter to which most Americans are getting their viewpoints these days. Write, speak, film, sing, and scream from the treetops if you need to. Third, bear witness. Document and report police brutality and government repression. File complaints, testify in court. Throughout history, occupation has always required the consent of the occupied. Don't consent. It's time to organize resistance. And finally, and perhaps most important, set an example worth emulating. Most of us were not born to radical parents. What sparked you? Find out what that was and ignite it in someone else. Together, we can take our country back, protect the planet, and maybe even save the world. As Italian communist Antonio Gramsci once wrote in his prison notebooks, we must live our lives by pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. The one, the spur to action, the other, the resilience to believe that such action will result in meaningful change, even in the face of adversity. For my generation, this is our Red Scare. This is our challenge, and if we don't win it, the country is not worth living in. Thank you.